By the time Diamond Select took over Art Asylum, the Star Trek line had already begun to wane. What had started out as quite an ambitious line with their Enterprise, Star Trek Nemesis figures, and of course their original series figures. By the time it came to the Next Generation line, it started to feel a little bit less creative, and we start to see less articulation and less experimentation. For example, some of those rubber pieces that we'd see as tunics in the original series line, or more aggressively the pants in the Enterprise line, were abandoned. In certain cases, this may be down to the fact that it didn't work so well with certain releases. However, it does also feel like there was a little bit less effort, a little bit less creativity being applied to this line of figures. The Next Generation line of figures, whilst still nicely produced, the line wouldn't be quite as comprehensive. Yes, we would get the entire crew, but there wouldn't be that much in the way of an expanded universe. There wouldn't be any supporting characters or villains really, or aliens, with maybe one or two notable exceptions such as Q and Lore. Having said this, it did seem that Diamond Select were committed to seeing out all of the major characters across the various series and spin-offs, and so they would turn their attention to Deep Space Nine. But sadly, despite having some plans to expand this line, it would be very short-lived, going to just 2 waves. And so over the course of 2 videos, I'm going to take a look at the figures produced for Deep Space Nine in this line. And in this first part, I'm going to focus my attention on the crew. Now, it's probably worth pointing out that the first Deep Space Nine releases were actually the Trials and Tribulations figures, which were essentially the original series figures with brand new head sculpts of the DS9 crew. This line just consisted of the 4 figures, which was Sisko, Dax, Bashir, and Chief O'Brien. These basically came in the original series packaging, and they also came with the original series accessories, phaser, tricorder, etc. The only real difference was there's a slight tweak to the card art, so instead of seeing Kirk and Bones and Spock, we can see Sisko, Dak and Bashir, and of course there is also the Deep Space Nine logo. But it wouldn't be until a few years later when we'd actually get some dedicated Deep Space Nine figures in their more recognisable series accurate costumes. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the era they decided to design was of course the Season 7 costumes, because this also happened to tie in with their Nemesis line that they were doing for the Next Generation. I personally don't have a problem with this, I actually really like these costumes anyway, but there's certainly enough room for variance in this line because across the years this crew had a number of different outfits. But sadly that would never come to pass because this would be the only costumes in which these characters would be released in this line. So first up we have Captain Sisko. And as much as I love these outfits on screen, there's something very disappointing about them in toy form because they seem a little bit dull and just not very colourful and interesting. And I don't think there's anything glaringly wrong with this figure at first glance, but there is a slight sense of it being a little bit too blocky and not quite authentic. And I think this carries through into the head sculpt, which just doesn't look right to me. This isn't a terrible sculpt, it's not a terrible likeness by any stretch, but if we compare this to a Season 7 production photo of Avery Brooks, we can see that there's a little bit of a gap here between the two. I just think the head sculpt here is just a little bit too thin, a little bit too narrow, and it's kind of lost a little bit of the likeness through that, I think. It just doesn't look quite right. And by this point in the series, the actor was more heavy set, he was a bigger frame than this figure would lead you to believe. The other thing you might notice here is that the sculpt of the beard hair on the chin far extends beyond where the actual painted line is, so it looks a little bit strange that basically all of his chin is sculpted with a beard, but it's only actually painted at the very bottom. So yeah, it's a little bit of an oddity, it's a little bit distracting. Also, you may notice on mine, the left arm, where the bicep is, that joint there, it's actually quite loose. Like, that's very, very, very loose. It's coming away a little bit. Now, this, of course, may just be my figure. Of course, I'm not saying it's on all of them. But nevertheless, it does indicate that maybe the quality control wasn't quite as tight at this point. You may also notice that the mould they've used for the torso here doesn't have the line down where the jacket opens, whereas some of the Nemesis figures do have that. This one doesn't. Now that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it does mean there's a little bit less detail, a little bit less interesting than some of the other figures in the line, and it does unfortunately continue the rather sad trend of having very different colours for the shoulders. Or you'd think they'd use the same grey paint across all of them, but they all seem to vary quite rapidly, so they never look quite consistent. And my final nitpick would be, it's a shame about the pips on the collar. They've just been painted on there. It's fine, but it would have been nicer if they'd been sculpted in as well. In terms of articulation, he has a ball-jointed neck, which means of course he can spin his head from side to side, and he can also look up and down a really good distance actually. This is one of the better neck joints that I've seen in this line. He's also got these hinged shoulders as well. Now, they do look like ball joints, but they're not actually. They only really hinge out. They don't really rotate or come out any further than this, so it is a little bit limited. Now, he does have a swivel at the bicep, and he's also got a hinge at the elbow, which bends to roughly 90 degrees. And then, of course, he's also got a swivel at the wrist as well. Now, sadly, there is no ab crunch or no torso articulation. He just has a swivel at the waist. Once again, at the hips, there is just a swivel there, so the legs do kick forwards, they don't really kick back at all, and he has a hinge at the knee there, so again, bending to about 90 degrees, and there's also a hinge at the foot. So the foot is articulated, it can move a little bit forwards and backwards, but not a huge deal. Now, for accessories, he does come with his baseball and his baseball cap, but he also comes with this phaser rifle as well. Now, I can't remember, I'm racking my brains whether they actually used this in the TV show, whether it was just in the movies, because the phaser rifle I remember Sisko using quite a lot in this series was this one. And this weapon doesn't come packaged with this figure, or any of these figures to be honest. This actually comes from a 2-pack with Worf, which I'll look at in the next video. But if you can get your hands on this, then this is a nice fit for this figure, and it fits very neatly into his grip there. And this looks pretty decent, I have to say, when you put this together. It's not quite perfect because, unfortunately, his left hand can't really grip the other handle, but you can kind of rest it there, and it creates the impression. I think this is strong enough. Next up we have Kira, and Kira definitely seems to suffer from some of the issues that I have with some of the female characters in this sort of next generation era line of figures, and that is they seem to be pre-molded into a certain position or shape, and you can kind of see here how she's kind of leaning to the side a little bit. And this plays merry hell when you're trying to pose them, and this figure in particular has a tendency to fall down a lot. And once again, I'm not wild about the head sculpt. I think the likeness, it's not bad to be fair. I think it's pretty decent, and I do like the detailing, particularly in the earring. I think the paint apps there are really nicely done. The sculpt is really good, and I like how they've got the accuracy of the hair going back over the ear there is very well done. But the likeness itself is a little bit off, and I think that's all down to the sculpt of the head. It just feels it's kind of too large, really, particularly on this body. The body feels out of proportion, like it feels like a much smaller frame, and it's almost like a bobblehead. It just seems too large for me, and it just doesn't look right. Hopefully here you can see what I mean about the figure tending to lean just off-center a little bit, leaning a little bit to the right there. It just looks a little bit strange, a little bit incongruous. It just doesn't look great, and the trouble is that it also really limits the amount of poses that you can put her in, so you kind of are very limited with this figure. The articulation scheme, of course, is exactly the same as we saw with Sisko. She has a ball-jointed head, so she can turn her head from side to side and look up and down, and this moves a pretty good distance, has a pretty decent range here, which I'm quite pleased with. Her shoulder articulation is a lot stronger here, it definitely moves a much further distance than we saw with the Sisko figure, which is really good, and she's also got the bicep swivel there as well, so this is all really good, and she's also got that hinge at the elbow there as well, allowing it to bend to 90 degrees, and the swivel at the wrist as well, which is great stuff. Now, once again, there is sadly no upper torso articulation, but she does have the swivel at the waist, and of course she's also got the swivel at the hips there, allowing the legs to kick forwards, but not back. Same articulation in the knees and in the feet, but as you can see, at least the feet do have a pretty decent range of motion. Next up, we have Chief O'Brien. Once again, the mould seems ever so slightly off here. I think, the actual actor has a much bigger frame, and this looks a little bit too tall and too narrow, really. And once again, in terms of the likeness, it's a little bit disappointing because although there is a pretty decent approximation of the actor, I mean, we can definitely recognise that it's Chief O'Brien, but there's just something off with it. And again, I think it's the same issue. I think the head's just been elongated, and I think it needed to be a little bit shorter, a little bit rounder, to be, more distinctive, more clearly identifiable as that character. As it is, it just feels a little bit too long. Now, there's definitely features there, you can definitely recognise the actor in it, but it's a little bit of a stretch, which is a real shame. Now, one of the things I've really praised this series for is the fact that every figure has a slightly different mould. Usually it's very, very subtle, but they are all different from each other. And I still think the same thing rings true here, but I have to say, in hand, they look awfully similar. If we put the Chief O'Brien and the Sisko next to each other, in hand, they look like they could be the same mould. Now, we can see here that actually they are different. If we think about, obviously, the Sisko here is fractionally taller and fractionally slimmer than O'Brien, but the torso pieces look suspiciously similar. Like in terms of where the creases are, it could almost be the same part. Now, I think it's different. I don't think they've just repainted it and give it a slightly different paint on the shoulder pads. I do think it is a different mold, but it's very, very close. And I definitely think with a series like this, when you have these figures that are in fairly dull costumes and they're all pretty much the same, you need to vary it up a little bit more. And I think, again, they just don't really look authentic. They don't really look like they're capturing what we see on screen in terms of their frame and their proportions. It just looks ever so slightly off. Next up we have Odo, and I have to say Odo is probably one of my favourites in this DS9 line. Mainly because he has a lot more colour in his costume, and it's nice to have a different and more distinctive outfit to brighten up this collection. I also think this is probably one of the strongest likenesses. The head sculpt is really very good here. But then we should probably expect that, since this is obviously one of the easier molds to get right. Again, if I was going to quibble, I would say it's probably a little bit too elongated. It probably should have been just fractionally a little bit wider, but nevertheless, this is pretty solid. This is obviously quite recognisable as Odo, and I think they've done a really nice job of this one, so no complaints here. One of the things I really love about this figure is the fact that he is in his Bajoran outfit, and as I said, it's nice and colourful, which is fantastic, but more than that, I just really like that it's a different costume, that it's a completely different alien. So we're seeing the Bajorans here, we're seeing a Bajoran outfit. It's just nice to have a bit more variety and distinctiveness within this line. After all, Star Trek is a very colourful world, full of all kinds of different aliens and cultures, and it's nice to kind of see that represented a little bit in the figure collection here. And it also means that we get to see something brand new in terms of the sculpt. Now, as I said, the sculpt across these figures does seem to be unique for every single one, but here we see something that's very visually obvious different, which is kind of cool. So even the boots here are a completely different mould, and they just look very different. His articulation scheme is the same as the others in the line, and there's no compromise here because it's a different sculpt or a different costume, which is great. So that ball jointed neck there works just as well on this figure as it did on the Sisko. In fact, I think it probably works a little bit better because the neck doesn't seem quite as long, thanks to that high collar that he's got. So it works really nicely. He's of course got the same sort of hinge at the shoulders there, which isn't quite a ball joint, which is a shame, but it comes out fair distance here, and he's got the bicep swivel, of course, and all the other articulation that we saw earlier. Now, one key difference is that he actually does have a rubber tunic at the very bottom here, which is meant to aid the articulation. I suppose it's meant to support the legs moving forward, and you can just force it through, but there's still an awful lot of resistance there. So this rubber could have been a little bit thinner and a little bit more flexible to allow maximum articulation. It works, but it's a bit of a struggle. Otherwise, he's got the single jointed knee and of course the hinge at the ankle there. And Odo also comes with some unique accessories as well at least one in particular. He has his bucket there, which is of course what he uses in the show. It's not the most exciting prop in the world as accessories go, but it is distinctive. It is something that comes from the show. It is a character piece, which is quite nice to have. You also notice that he has the Bajoran phase pistol there, and Kira also comes with this as well, which is pretty cool. So I like that these are a more distinctive weapon types. Obviously gold there, very colourful and bright, so this really helps these figures, I think, rather than the dull grey of the phases. Now, these weren't the only figures that we got in these waves. Sadly, these are the only ones that I've actually got in my collection, but there were a handful of other characters as well to round out the crew. So we actually got both versions of Dax. We've got Jadzia and Ezri, which is pretty cool, to be fair. And Ezri has some nice little details. She has obviously that eye patches, which is really cool, and that very distinctive, unique weapon to that figure, I believe, which is very cool. And you can also see here that she also came with her Ratticino mug, a baseball cap, and a data pad as well, which is kind of cool in terms of accessories. And this is probably a good opportunity for me to talk a little bit about the packaging as well. As you'll see, they've kind of mirrored what they did with the Next Generation line. It is essentially the same clamshell in the insignia logo sort of shape. And in terms of the artwork, the backdrop to the interior of the card obviously is the wormhole, which is a very nice touch. And then we also have some of the characters, key characters, on the artwork on the top right hand side panel as well. As I said, they also did Jadzia Dax as well, which is obviously another key character, so really cool to see this character as well in the line. You'll notice in terms of accessories, she also comes with a bat'leth, which is great, and a couple of other bits and pieces as well, that we've seen before. From the various photographs I've seen, both of these Daxes look to be pretty decent sculpt, to be honest, probably much better than the ones that we've got in this video today. And then finally, we have Dr. Bashir. Now, sadly, these figures are quite scarce, they're quite difficult to get hold of these days, which is a real shame. So if you're hoping to track them down on the secondary market, you should expect to pay a premium. So they did do a pretty good job of getting virtually all of the crew out. If we take the war from the Nemesis line and throw them in here, then we've got a pretty decent lineup of these characters. The only character who's really crucial, who's missing, is Quark, and it's a real shame that we didn't get him in this line because A, I think he's a really important character to this show, but B, I think he would have been a really interesting visual character to have in the line. He would have obviously been a different size, a very different costume, he would have been much more colourful, and it would have been cool to actually have a Ferengi in the collection. Because sadly, since Playmates gave up the license, we haven't seen a Ferengi figure in over 2 decades. To be fair, Diamond Select did have plans to expand this Deep Space Nine line, so maybe Quark might have shown up then. For example, we did get to see this command chair on display at a toy fair, but sadly it would never see production and would never make its way into collectors' hands. And the original prototype design actually shows a different Sisko altogether with this chair. Obviously has a very different head sculpt, I think this one's a lot better, and also crucially he's in his older uniform, he's in his Season 4 outfit. So it's entirely possible that we might have seen some of the other characters in their earlier season outfits as well. We could have had some decent variants in this line. Perhaps one in particular that I can think of would have been Kira, because although she does wear that outfit in Season 7, for most of the show's run she was obviously in her red outfit, so it's a shame that we didn't really get her in that. But the biggest disappointment for me was this planned 2-pack with Gul Dukat. Once again, we see an entirely different Sisko. This is a Sisko with hair, with no beard, so of course this is his Season 1/Season 2 outfit. He also comes with a pretty cool Bajoran prop as well, which is obviously very significant. It holds one of the orbs, so this is something we see again and again in the show, so it would have been really nice to have this. But yeah, most crucially for me, having a Dukat figure, or at least a Cardassian figure, obviously one of the big characters in Deep Space Nine, and even in Next Generation. And it would have been fantastic to just fill out this line with a few more aliens and make it a bit more versatile, a bit more diverse and interesting, and just make it feel a bit more complete. I have to say though, looking at this prototype, this doesn't strictly look like Gul Dukat. I don't know whether this was a generic Cardassian they were going for, maybe it would have been released separately, or whether it just wasn't a particularly strong sculpt of the actor, but nevertheless this would have been absolutely fantastic, and I'm really disappointed that we never got this. Okay, so there you have it. There is the crew from Deep Space Nine from Diamond Select, or Art Asylum. In the next video, I will take a look at the one alien that they did do quite a few versions of, and that of course is the Klingons. And there's a couple of key Klingon characters that we got to see as part of this line, so I'll be looking at them next. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like, and remember to subscribe as there'll be plenty more videos soon.